They say the story was first told by a Cimmeria trader who had no reason to lie and every reason to keep silent. He had crossed the northern passes late in the season when the snow already began to harden like stone, and it was there, in a firelit tavern, half buried in ice, that he heard men speak in lowered voices about the Grey Hunters, not as soldiers, not as a tribe in the usual sense, but as something older, something that did not belong in the catalogue of known peoples. Even the barbarian guides refused to name them directly, as though speaking too clearly might draw attention. It was in that same place, among the smoke and the trembling of drunken hands, that he first heard the name of the man they had taken, Conan of Cimmeria. The trader claimed that at first he thought it was just another northern exaggeration. A strong man, a violent man, perhaps a raider of some reputation, inflated by fear. But the tone of the room changed whenever his name was spoken, as if even skeptical men felt uneasy repeating it too often. The Grey Hunters had marked him, and once they marked a man, there was no law, no border, no offering of gold or blood that could end the pursuit. They hunted for 7 days, not in haste, not in rage, but in the way wolves might follow a wounded beast that still believes itself to be free. And on the 8th day, something happened that none of them had ever witnessed before. The hunted stopped behaving like prey. Conan first sensed the wrongness before he understood its shape. It was in the way the forest refused sound. No birds moved in the canopy above the frozen pines. No insects disturbed the damp soil beneath the old roots. Even the wind, which usually cut through the northern valleys like an impatient blade, seemed reluctant to pass between the trees. He found the first body hanging from a cedar that had grown twisted by centuries of storms. The man had been left deliberately exposed to the cold. His skin had darkened to the color of old leather, stretched tight over bone. But what unsettled Conan was not the corpse itself. It was the absence around it. There were no tracks in the snow beneath the tree, no signs of struggle in the surrounding earth, as if the man had been placed there without the ground ever agreeing to record the act. Conan stepped closer. The bark of the cedar had been carved with shallow cuts, not deep enough to wound the tree, but precise enough to leave intent behind. Symbols, half erased by frost, ran in a circular pattern around the trunk, not written by priests, not by scribes, by hands that understood hunting more than language, a marking of ownership, not of land, of prey. He did not linger. Men who decorated their kills in this manner were not interested in audiences. The trail led him deeper into the northern passes, where the mountains began to close like jaws and the sky turned the color of old iron. The path itself was not hidden, yet it was not obvious either. Signs appeared too neatly placed to be accidental. Broken branches angled in subtle directions, stones stacked in ways that suggested intention rather than collapse. Faint disturbances in the snow that guided rather than concealed. Conan recognized the logic of it. This was not pursuit. It was choreography. Whoever followed him wanted him to keep moving in a controlled pattern, as though the forest itself had been turned into a corridor. By late afternoon, he reached what remained of a small camp. The fire had died long ago, but its ashes still held the shape of its last moments. 3 bedrolls lay half buried in frost, untouched since their owners vanished. A strip of meat still hung from a broken branch above the ashes, frozen mid-roast, blackened on one side, as if time had been interrupted rather than completed. Conan knelt beside the fire. No blood, No scattered weapons, no dragged bodies, only disappearance, the kind that did not belong to ordinary violence. He shifted his gaze slowly across the ground, reading it the way a man reads a confession written in dirt. There were footprints leading into the camp, but none leaving it. Not a single trail pointed outward, as though the men had never decided to leave at all. Yet something else caught his attention. The snow at the edge of the camp had been pressed down in a wide arc, forming a pattern too deliberate to be natural. Whoever had stood there had not rushed. They had circled the camp at a measured pace, observing, waiting, as if studying animals before deciding which to take first. Conan rose. Only then did he notice that the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was occupied. Somewhere beyond the trees, something moved with patient discipline, keeping distance, but never losing sight. Not one presence, several, spreading through the forest with the calm coordination of men who had done this many times before. The Cimmerian rested a hand on his sword, not drawing it yet, but acknowledging its weight. He had walked into hunting ground, and whatever had marked him had no intention of letting him leave it alive. The mountains changed their character as night came down. It was not a simple fading of light into darkness, but something heavier, as if the land itself lowered its gaze and decided to watch in silence. The wind that had been absent during the day returned in uneven breaths, slipping through the pines in long, tired waves that carried the smell of cold stone and distant storms. Conan did not return to the trail. He left it, not out of confusion, but understanding. The path ahead was not meant to be followed in a straight line. Whoever had been guiding him through the forest had been shaping his movement, narrowing his options without ever blocking them outright. Staying on that path any longer would mean accepting the role assigned to him. Prey did not choose direction, so he stepped off it. The forest immediately felt different once he did. The subtle signs that had been placed for him no longer appeared. The broken branches no longer pointed. The stones no longer spoke. Instead, there was only the raw, unfiltered wilderness, older and less forgiving, where nothing had been prepared in advance and nothing waited with intention. For the first time since entering the valley, Conan slowed, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. He had been followed long before he saw the first corpse. Now he had to decide whether to be followed blindly or to understand the shape of those who hunted him. He chose neither escape nor confrontation yet. Instead, he searched for ground that would reveal movement. A narrow ridge of stone rose between two dark slopes, exposed enough to deny ambush from above, but fractured enough to offer concealment in its cracks. He climbed it without haste, placing each step with the precision of a man who understood that sound traveled farther at night than sight. At the top he stopped. The valley below stretched in layered shadows, broken only by the pale glimmer of snow where the moon dared to touch the earth. From there he could see how the forest bent in subtle distortions, as if something large had passed through it recently and never truly left. Then he saw them, not all at once. First a shift in darkness near the tree line, then another, and another. They did not emerge as a charge or formation. There was no rush, no battle cry, no announcement of presence. They simply appeared in fragments, as if the forest itself had decided to give them shape one piece at a time. Tall men, broad shoulders wrapped in layered hides that had long since stopped resembling animal skins, and instead became something closer to armor shaped by ritual rather than craft. Their skin was painted in pale ash tones that erased the warmth of flesh under moonlight. Their faces were hidden behind masks made from skulls, not decorative but functional, each one worn smooth by years of use. They moved without wasted motion, not cautious, not nervous, certain. Conan counted them without thinking. 7 visible, more behind them. Always more behind them. They spread across the lower slope with deliberate spacing, never clustering, never overlapping sight lines. Hunters trained not to pursue animals, but to deny escape routes. Every angle was controlled. Every corridor of forest quietly claimed. The Cimmerian remained still. He understood pursuit. He understood war. He understood men who chased for glory, for vengeance, for coin. This was none of those. There was no anger in their movement, only method, a ritual given physical form. One of them raised a hand slowly, not as a signal to attack, but as a confirmation. The others responded by stopping where they stood, each one locking into position as though the forest itself had given them invisible markers to occupy. Then came the horns, low, deep, not musical, but resonant, like bone being spoken through. The sound did not travel in one direction. It echoed from multiple points in the valley, overlapping, answering itself, surrounding the ridge until distance became meaningless. Conan turned his head slightly. Too many positions, too much coordination. This was not a single hunting party. It was a system, and he was already inside it. The first arrow struck the stone beside him an instant later, exploding into fragments that scattered across the ridge like frozen sparks. Conan dropped immediately, rolling into the fractured shadow between 2 rocks as more impacts followed in rapid sequence. Not chaotic, controlled. Each shot adjusted for the previous impact, tightening the space around him rather than flooding it. They were learning his position as he moved, not guessing, correcting. He pressed himself deeper into the stone's shadow as a second volley arrived, striking higher, anticipating the instinct to rise after the first attack. One arrow grazed his shoulder, cutting through leather and skin in a clean, precise line. The pain was immediate, sharp enough to demand attention, but Conan did not react beyond a slight tightening of breath. Pain was information, not instruction. He shifted position instead, sliding down the opposite side of the ridge into a narrow fissure barely wide enough to fit a man. The stone walls closed around him, muting sound and breaking sight lines. Above, footsteps moved along the ridge with measured patience, not searching in panic, but sweeping systematically, as though marking sections of land that had already been assigned meaning. Conan pressed his hand against the wound. Warm blood met cold air and thickened quickly against his fingers. Still watching, still listening. The horns continued in the distance, adjusting now, no longer signaling location, but coordination. The hunters were no longer reacting to him. They were organizing around him. And in that moment, as he crouched inside stone and shadow, Conan understood the true nature of the pursuit. He had not been ambushed. He had been selected. The stone fissure did not feel like shelter. It felt like being swallowed slowly by something older than the mountains themselves. Cold pressed in from every direction, not as air but as weight, as if the rock had memory and resented being disturbed. Conan stayed inside it long enough for the rhythm of the hunt above to settle into patterns he could read. Footsteps passed along the ridge in measured intervals, never rushing, never pausing too long. The Grey Hunters did not search as men normally searched. They allocated space. Each of them moved as part of a larger design, like pieces placed on a board whose edges Conan had not yet seen. Blood from his shoulder had thickened against his skin, binding leather to flesh in a stiff crust. He'd peeled it away carefully, not from caution, but necessity. Wounds left unattended in cold terrain did not weaken a man immediately. They weakened him later, when the body believed it was safe enough to fail. He had learned that lesson in younger wars. Above him the horns sounded again, not closer, not farther, simply present, like an unbroken thought moving through the valley. The sound no longer carried urgency. It carried confirmation. They had not lost him. They had simply adjusted. Conan exhaled slowly through his nose, so they understood patience. That mattered. Men who hunted in rage could be tricked. Men who hunted in discipline required a different language. He shifted deeper into the fissure until the stone pressed against his spine and shoulders. From there he could see a narrow slice of the sky above the ridge. Stars flickered through thin cloud cover, pale and indifferent, as though the entire valley existed beneath a forgotten sky that refused to intervene. Time passed in broken fragments. A stone loosened somewhere above. A shadow moved across the opening. A distant command was spoken in a language too old to belong to any civilized tongue Conan had ever heard. It was not shouted. It was delivered with calm authority, and the response came instantly from multiple directions. They were tightening the structure, closing invisible lines. He understood then that staying inside the fissure would eventually become death by containment, not starvation, not direct attack, but reduction of options until movement itself became predictable. So he waited for change instead of forcing it. It came when the wind shifted. A colder current slipped down from the upper slopes, carrying with it the smell of pitch and resin from higher pines. Conan used that moment. He moved not upward, not outward, but sideways through a narrow fracture in the rock that barely admitted his shoulders. Stone scraped skin, old wounds reopened. He did not stop. The fissure opened into a shallow hollow carved by ancient runoff, partially hidden beneath overhanging stone. Here the wind carried more freely, masking sound. Here fire could exist without immediate detection if managed correctly. Conan gathered what little dry material he could find. Brittle moss, dead roots, fragments of bark hidden beneath snow. He worked without haste. Fire was not survival alone. Fire was signal. Fire was declaration. It had to be controlled as carefully as any blade. When the flame finally caught, it did so reluctantly, as though even fire in this valley required permission. Light flickered across stone walls, revealing surfaces scarred by time and mineral veins like frozen lightning beneath the rock. Conan fed the flame just enough to keep it alive, never allowing it to grow into something visible beyond the hollow. Then he did something no hunted man would normally choose. He tended his wound openly in the firelight, not for comfort, for necessity. The leather wrap around his arm was already soaked through. He tore it away fully, exposing the gash beneath. The arrow had cut deeper than it first appeared. Flesh parted cleanly, in a line that would not close on its own in cold conditions. He had no proper thread, no needle, only survival. He stripped a thin cord from his belt, pressed the tip of a blade into the fire until it glowed dull red, and held his breath as he brought it to the wound. The smell came first. Burning flesh, not dramatic, not exaggerated, immediate, real. His jaw tightened, but no sound escaped him. The muscles in his arm trembled once, then stilled as he forced control over instinct. The heat sealed the cut in uneven sections, closing what the cold would otherwise destroy. When it was done, he remained still for a long moment, listening to the fire, listening to the mountain beyond it. Above, movement continued, closer now, not chaotic, directed toward heat signatures, toward life. Conan extinguished the fire with his boot. Darkness returned instantly, heavy and absolute, but it was too late. Somewhere beyond the hollow, a horn answered, short, sharp, confirmation received. They had found warmth, and warmth meant him. After the fire died, the valley changed again, not in sound or light, but in intention. The gray hunters no longer moved randomly across the slopes. Their presence began to align into structure Conan could recognize. He watched from the hollow's edge as shapes repositioned across the ridges, each one settling into a place that corresponded to another somewhere else in the darkness. What had begun as pursuit was becoming geometry, a net that did not tighten by speed, but by design. Conan understood nets. He had broken chains, iron collars, slave cages. But this was not built from metal. It was built from behavior. The realization came slowly, not as revelation, but as recognition of a familiar logic applied at a scale he had not expected. These men did not chase individuals. They reshaped terrain into systems that reduced individuality to predictability. And Conan, for the first time in days, was being studied not as a man, but as movement. He shifted position within the hollow, keeping low. From there, he began to observe rather than evade. Patterns emerged. The hunters did not overlap sight lines. They avoided redundancy. Each unit covered a specific angle of approach, ensuring that any motion within the valley would be seen by at least one observer, without ever needing to expose themselves unnecessarily. It was hunting refined into discipline. But discipline, Conan knew, always carried weakness. It required belief in structure, and belief could be misled. He watched for a long time, long enough for the cold to settle into bone, long enough for the hunters to believe nothing had changed. Then he moved again, not away from them, not toward them, across them. He descended from the hollow into terrain that appeared empty only to those who expected movement to be visible. Between two ridges, a narrow ravine cut through stone like a forgotten scar. Snow collected there unevenly, disturbed in places by wind rather than footfall. Conan entered it quietly, using the uneven terrain as cover rather than obstacle. Above, one of the hunters shifted position, not because he saw Conan, but because he expected him to appear elsewhere. That expectation was the first crack. Conan could not run. Running would reinforce the map they were building. Instead, he moved only when the hunters adjusted, always staying one decision behind their certainty. When they shifted left, he moved right. When they closed a ridge, he descended into shadow. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he stopped being a point within their system and began becoming an error inside it. At the edge of the ravine, he found something unexpected. A body, not fresh, not old, placed. The man's throat had been opened cleanly, but not in haste. The wound was deliberate, almost ritual in its precision. His hands were folded across his chest, and his mask, if it could be called, that lay beside him in the snow, made from bone and stitched hide. Conan studied him briefly, not out of curiosity, out of understanding. This was not a casualty of pursuit. This was a marker, a point of instruction. The Grey Hunters did not simply kill. They taught through placement. Conan rose slowly. For the first time since entering the valley, something shifted inside his understanding of the hunt. They were not trying to catch him. They were teaching him how they hunted. And somewhere in that realization, the nature of the next confrontation began to change. The Grey Hunters no longer moved like certainty. Something subtle had entered their discipline and imperfection, so small it would have been invisible to anyone who did not understand how perfect coordination should look. But Conan had learned their rhythm now. Not their language, not their rituals, but the timing of their attention. And that timing had begun to fracture. They still held the valley. That was the illusion. From the ridge lines to the narrow corridors of stone, their presence remained absolute. Ash-painted figures occupied the heights like carved extensions of the mountain itself. Horn signals still traveled between unseen positions with the same deep, bone-vibrating resonance. On the surface, nothing had changed. But men who hunted in perfect systems did not lose pieces without consequence, and pieces had begun to disappear. A scout found nothing where another had stood hours before. A position on the ridge remained occupied too long, then suddenly empty, as if the man had simply stopped existing between one breath and the next. No alarm was raised. Not at first. The Grey Hunters did not react emotionally. Their discipline resisted panic. Instead, they corrected. They reassigned positions. They tightened angles. They reduced uncertainty by compressing space around the unknown. But every correction carried cost. Every adjustment revealed that something was now operating inside their structure that did not belong there. Conan, not as a target anymore. As interference, he did not stay hidden in one place long enough to be trapped, nor did he retreat far enough to be excluded. He moved along the seams of their design, where visibility was partial and assumptions filled the gaps. He began to understand not just where they stood, but why. And that was where systems became vulnerable, because understanding why allowed prediction, and prediction allowed reversal. The valley, once a controlled hunting ground, began to feel different even to the hunters themselves. The spacing between signals grew slightly uneven. The responses to horn calls carried a fraction of delay. Not enough to collapse discipline, but enough to suggest strain beneath it. Conan noticed the first moment of hesitation when a ridge unit waited half a breath too long before repositioning. That hesitation was enough. It meant fear had entered the structure. Not fear of death, fear of error. And error in their culture was worse. The black soil was found where the stone broke open into an exposed vein of ancient earth, deep within a narrow ravine, where sunlight barely reached even at midday. Conan knelt beside it without immediately understanding its usefulness. It was not mud from rain or river. It was heavier, thicker, almost oily in texture, stained by minerals that gave it a dark sheen even in low light. It clung to the skin differently, not like dirt, like absence of light. He tested it on his fingers first, rubbing it across the back of his hand. The effect was immediate but simple. It erased contrast. Against stone, against shadow, against snow-dimmed terrain, the human outline softened. broken, less distinct. Conan did not hesitate. He began to coat himself, not as ritual, not as disguise in the civilized sense, but as adaptation. He covered exposed skin, then arms, then shoulders, working the black earth into his hair until even his face lost definition beneath the uneven layer. The cold air hardened it slightly as it dried, binding to sweat and blood already present from earlier wounds. When he stood again, he was no longer a figure moving through the valley. He was a disruption in its surface. The mountains did not change, but perception did. From a distance, even a trained eye would struggle to separate him from fracture lines in stone or shifting shadow between pines. And in a terrain built on observation that mattered more than armor, he moved again. But this time he was not reacting to the hunt. He was entering it. The first gray hunter died without warning, not during pursuit, during pause, a moment of still observation between repositioning signals. Conan came from below the ridge line, not climbing, not charging, simply appearing where attention was weakest. A hand covered in black earth closed over the man's mouth before sound could form, and the strike that followed was clean, controlled, and silent enough that even nearby positions did not immediately register the loss. The body was gone before the next horn call. The system did not yet fail, but it had begun to lag. Another hunter fell hours later, then another near a fractured slope where visibility collapsed into uneven stone and shadow. Each death did not trigger chaos. Instead, it triggered correction. The gray hunters tightened formations further, reduced spacing, increased vigilance. But vigilance requires direction, and Conan had learned how to misdirect it. He stopped being something they tracked. He became something they compensated for. The valley, once shaped entirely by their control, now carried a second presence moving inside it, one that did not obey structure, did not respect spacing, did not follow patterns of reinforcement. And slowly, inevitably, the hunters began to understand the shift. They were no longer conducting a hunt. They were inside one. A horn sounded, deeper and slower than before. Not signal, recognition. From the upper ridge, Conan watched them gather in partial formation for the first time since the pursuit began. Their movements were still disciplined, but discipline now carried weight. Something had changed in the way they occupied space. They were no longer certain the valley belonged to them. And in that uncertainty, Conan moved again closer, deeper, into the center of what remained of their structure. The counterhunt had begun to close.